In the spring of 336 BC, a young king arrived at the city of Corinth. He was 20 years old. The Greeks had just named him captain general of all their armies. In a year, he would cross into Asia. In 10 years, he would conquer the known world. History would remember him as Alexander the Great. But on this morning, in Corinth, Alexander wanted to meet a philosopher. He had heard there was an old man in this city who lived in a clay storage jar by the gymnasium, a man who refused, on principle, to stand when a king entered the room. Alexander found him sunbathing in the dirt. The king stood over him with his retinue and offered him anything in the world. The old man squinted up. He shaded his eyes. He said, "Stand out of my sunlight." Alexander's friends laughed nervously. The king did not. He turned to walk away, and as he walked he said, "If I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes." This is the story of the man in the jar. His full name was Diogenes of Sinope. He had been born around the year 412 BC in a Greek colony on the Black Sea coast. By the time of the Alexander encounter, he was nearly 80 years old. He had spent more than 50 of those years trying to prove a single scandalous idea, that every human being is born free of need, that the gods made human life simple, that civilization had wrapped the simple life in layers of property, status, manners, and shame, and that the philosopher's job was to peel those layers off. His school was called the Cynics. The word comes from the Greek kynikos, which means dog-like. It was an insult. His enemies called him the dog. He embraced the name. A dog, he said, eats anything, sleeps anywhere, is not ashamed of its body. A dog is honest. Over his tomb, in later years, a statue of a dog was carved in white marble. To understand how the dog came to live in a jar, one must go back to the beginning. Diogenes was the son of a banker. His father ran the mint of Sinope. The office required, among other things, stamping the city's coinage with the official seal. At some point, the coins of Sinope were debased. The metal was adulterated, the stamps falsified. A scandal broke. Diogenes was driven out of the city forever. The historian Diogenes Laertius preserved a strange tradition. Before the scandal, Diogenes had traveled to Delphi and asked the oracle of Apollo what he should do with his life. The oracle had answered with 2 words: deface the currency. In exile, Diogenes reinterpreted the words. The currency the oracle had meant was not the coin of Sinope. It was the false coin of human convention. Honor, property, reputation, shame, every counterfeit value the city stamped into its citizens. That, he said, was what the philosopher must deface. He arrived in Athens with nothing. In Athens he sought out a man named Antisthenes. Antisthenes had been one of the closest students of Socrates. He had been in the room when Socrates drank the hemlock. After his master's death, Antisthenes founded a school of his own. He taught that virtue was the only good, and that pleasure, fame, and wealth were distractions. He took no students. He drove them away with a stick. When Diogenes arrived and asked to be taught, Antisthenes raised the stick. Diogenes lowered his head. "Strike," he said. "You will find no stick hard enough to drive me away, so long as you have something to say." Antisthenes lowered the stick. He kept the student. From Socrates to Antisthenes to Diogenes, the line was set, each teacher harder than the last, each student more determined to live the doctrine than to merely speak it. What Diogenes lived by after that was not a philosophy. It was a series of subtractions. He gave away his property. He slept in the porches of public buildings. In the end, he made his home in a pithos, a large ceramic storage jar of the kind used to hold grain. The jar sat in the open ground near the temple of the Mother of the Gods. It had no door, no roof, no lock. He owned one cloak, folded double to serve as a blanket. He owned a wooden bowl. He owned a wooden cup. One day he watched a boy at a fountain drink water by cupping his hands. Diogenes broke the cup against the ground. "A child has beaten me in simplicity," he said. Some weeks later, he watched a boy eat lentils from a hollowed-out piece of bread. He threw away the bowl. By the end of his life, he carried only a stick and a leather satchel. The satchel held nothing of value, but it held everything he owned. The most famous image of Diogenes is not the jar, it is the lantern. One afternoon, in the full light of the Athenian midday, he walked into the agora carrying a lit oil lamp. He held the lamp up to the faces of the men he passed, to merchants, to philosophers, to politicians. When asked what he was looking for, he answered the same thing every time. "I am looking for a human being." The Greek word he used was anthropos. In a city that had given the world Pericles, Sophocles, and Plato, he claimed to find none. The charge behind the lantern was simple. The people of the city were not, in fact, men and women. They were performances, roles, costumes. They had been counterfeited. The currency had to be defaced. The man who most felt the sting of these accusations was Plato. Plato was, at the time, the most respected philosopher in Athens. He ran a school called the Academy, north of the city walls. He taught that the world of the senses was a shadow, and that true reality lay in the realm of ideal forms. Diogenes despised the doctrine. Once, in a lecture, Plato defined a human being as a featherless biped. Diogenes walked the next day to the market. He bought a chicken. He plucked it. He walked into the academy. He threw the bird at Plato's feet and said, "Behold, Plato's man." Plato, the source's record, was forced to amend his definition. A human being became a featherless biped with broad, flat nails. The two men never reconciled. Plato called Diogenes Socrates gone mad. Diogenes called Plato a fraud. Each was, in his way, telling the truth. Some time after the lantern, perhaps in his 60s, Diogenes left Athens for the island of Aegina. He never arrived. The ship was captured by pirates. The crew and passengers were taken to a slave market in Crete. Diogenes was put up for auction. When the auctioneer asked him what skill he could offer, the old philosopher answered, "I know how to govern men." He pointed at a buyer in fine robes and said, "Sell me to that one. He looks like he needs a master." The buyer was a Corinthian named Xeniades. Xeniades brought the slave home and put him in charge of educating his two sons. The old man taught them to ride, to hunt, to sit at table, to dress simply, to eat plain food, to bear hardship without complaint. When the boys were grown, they said, their father had given them a tutor, and the tutor had given them a life. Diogenes spent the rest of his years in Corinth. It was in Corinth that Alexander found him. Alexander's visit was no chance encounter. The king had heard the stories, the featherless biped, the lantern, the barrel. He had been told by men who had seen Diogenes that the old philosopher was the only man in Greece who would not stand up when a king entered the room. Alexander wanted to see for himself. He came to a sloping grove called Kranion on the edge of Corinth. He found Diogenes lying in the dust, sunbathing. The exchange was brief. "What is anything I can give you?" the king asked. "Stand out of my sunlight," the old man said. It is the most famous answer in the history of philosophy. It was also, on its face, a refusal of patronage, a refusal of empire, a refusal of the entire framework in which a king has things to give and a free man has things to want. Alexander, who in a year would burn Persepolis, who in a decade would die in Babylon believing himself a god, walked away from the grove that morning a quieter man. "If I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes," he said. The sources record that he meant it. Diogenes never wrote a treatise. The Cynics, on principle, did not. A book, he said, was a sleeping pill. His teaching method was his life. He ate in the marketplace, where eating was considered shameful. He slept in the open, where sleeping was considered low. He performed every private act in the public squares, where they would shock his audience the most. It was a deliberate strategy. The Greeks had two words for what he was doing: The first was parrhesia. It meant frank speech, saying the true thing without softening, regardless of consequence or rank. The second was ascesis. It meant training. For Diogenes, philosophy was not lectures. It was conditioning. Every act of voluntary hardship, every meal of barley bread instead of meat, every night on stone was a rep in the gymnasium of the soul. When the body learned that comfort was optional, the soul learned that fear of losing comfort was a lie. That, he said, was freedom. There was no other kind. The ancient sources disagree about how Diogenes died. Diogenes Laertius lists 3 accounts. In the first, he held his breath until he died. In the second, he ate a raw octopus and was sickened. In the third, he was bitten by a dog, a fitting end for the man who called himself one. All 3 accounts agree that he died in Corinth, in the year 323 BC, at the age of 89. Alexander the Great died the same year in Babylon. The king was 32, the most powerful man in the world, and the man who had owned nothing passed out of life on the same calendar. Diogenes' friends asked him near the end how he wished to be buried. He told them to throw his body over the city wall and let it be eaten by wild animals. They protested. He told them to place a stick beside the body so he could drive the animals away. "But you will be dead," they said. "What harm can the animals do to you then?" "Then what harm," he said, "can being thrown over the wall do to me?" He died at dawn. Diogenes left no school behind him. He had refused on principle to formalize his teaching, but he had taught one man closely, a student named Crates of Thebes. Crates had been wealthy. He gave away his fortune in the public square and went to live as Diogenes had lived. Crates, in turn, taught a young man named Zeno. Zeno had come to Athens after surviving a shipwreck. He had lost everything in the wreck and walked into a bookseller's shop. He read aloud from a book about Socrates. He asked the bookseller where men like that could still be found. The bookseller pointed at Crates passing by in the street. "Follow that man." Zeno did. He studied under Crates for years, and then he founded his own school. He called it the Stoicism, the philosophy that would later guide Seneca, Epictetus, and the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Every Stoic in history is, in a direct line of teaching, a great-grand student of Diogenes. The word cynic is still used today. It means, in modern English, someone bitter, sneering, distrustful. That is not what the original cynics were. They were not bitter. They were free. They mocked power because they did not need it. They lived simply because they wanted nothing. In the city of Sinope, where Diogenes was born, and from which he was banished, a statue stands today in the central square. It is of an old man holding a lantern. He is looking for a human being.